I'm Patricia Ezechie, and this is Proactive Empowered Careers, a space for thinking about careers differently, not as something separate from who you are, but as an expression of you and the life you want to live. Hello everyone and welcome back. And if you're new here, you're very welcome. In the last episode, we talked about learning to listen to yourself, not just when things feel dramatic, but in everyday ways. Noticing your energy, your reactions, your curiosity, your discomfort. And when you begin to listen more, you start to notice something else happening too. More questions. And you might be starting to get the gist of how this works by now. As you listen, new questions emerge. And that's not a problem. In fact, it's often a really good sign, because when your mind starts to ask these kinds of questions, it usually means something is shifting, even if it feels a little unsettling at the same time. And one of the questions that often comes next when we're in this space is this: how do I trust what I'm hearing? Because listening to yourself and trusting yourself aren't the same thing. You can hear yourself quite clearly and still override it, still second guess it, and still talk yourself out of it. So in this episode, I want to explore this idea of self-trust, not as confidence or certainty, but as something quieter, something that develops over time, and something that's much more practical than it might sound. So let's take a closer look at what we mean when we talk about self-trust or trusting yourself, because it's often misunderstood. It can sound like something fixed, like a personality trait, like something you either have or you don't have. You might think of people who seem confident, decisive, sure of themselves, and others who hesitate, second guess, or look for reassurance. And it's easy to assume that's what self-trust is. But it's not quite that. Because self-trust isn't really about personality. It's not about something you're born with or without. It's something that develops. And one way to understand this is to think about trust in any relationship. When we think about that, we realize that it grows over time. When someone shows up, when there's some consistency, when what they say and what they do begin to match. And self-trust works in a very similar way. It develops when you begin to listen to yourself and respond to what you hear, even in the smallest of ways, even imperfectly, and even when you don't always get it right. Because part of building trust in yourself is also learning not to turn against yourself when you don't get it right. Is to notice what happened without harshness and to adjust and try again. For example, resting when you're tired, saying no when something doesn't feel right, allowing a moment of curiosity, stepping away when something feels off. On their own, these moments might seem small, but over time, they start to build. And that's what self-trust is made of, not certainty, but a growing sense that you can hear yourself and act on what you hear. And then from that, a greater sense of agency begins to develop in your life and your career. So if self-trust develops over time through listening to yourself and responding to what you hear, why do so many of us struggle to trust ourselves? And I think it's often because we've learned to override ourselves. And that's usually for understandable reasons. Because at different points in our lives, listening to ourselves hasn't always felt like the safest option. Sometimes that's about belonging. Saying yes when saying no might have set you apart, going along with something because you don't want to disrupt the status quo, the dynamic. Sometimes it's about safety, keeping the peace, avoiding conflict, not taking a risk that might have real consequences. And sometimes it shows up in professional environments where being easy to work with, reliable, adaptable is rewarded. And over time, you learn to prioritize what's expected over what you're actually noticing. Sometimes it's shaped by family dynamics. What was encouraged, what wasn't, what felt acceptable and what didn't feel acceptable. So little by little, overriding what you feel or sense or know becomes the norm. It doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It just feels like how you operate in the world. And many, many capable people become very good at this. So good, in fact, that they stop noticing themselves in the process. Self-trust isn't missing. It hasn't disappeared. It's still there. It's just over time, it's been ignored and interrupted and dulled down. Another reason that trusting yourself can feel difficult is in times of uncertainty. Because when we feel uncertain, it's often the moment when things start to feel a lot less clear. And that's where we begin to question ourselves. And we might genuinely begin to wonder, what if I'm wrong? What if I regret this? What if this is just an emotion? What if this is the wrong thing to do? And when those questions start to appear, it's very easy to begin questioning what you're noticing in the first place. To second guess yourself, to doubt yourself. And in that space, looking outside of yourself can start to feel safer, because that's where we're going to get reassurance and get confirmation. We begin to let someone else hold the responsibility for the direction, the decisions that we need to make. And when we're uncertain, that makes sense, because uncertainty is uncomfortable. And in that space of discomfort is exactly where that feeling of self-trust has often been interrupted before. So trusting yourself doesn't come from eliminating uncertainty. It doesn't come from knowing everything for sure. It comes from being willing to stay with what you're noticing, even when you don't know how things will turn out. Staying connected to your own experience, what you're thinking and feeling in your own body, rather than stepping away from it. That's where trusting yourself actually develops. Not after the uncertainty has gone, but while you're still in it. Because self-trust isn't about being able to predict the right outcome. It's about staying present with yourself as you move through the unknown. And that's why it can often feel much quieter than we expect it to. Because when you stay with yourself, even as you move through the unknown, it doesn't usually look or feel dramatic. It looks like small, congruent choices. Pausing and giving yourself a moment to check in before you agree to something. Expressing a preference even if it feels slightly uncomfortable. Noticing discomfort and not immediately dismissing it. And choosing rest when part of you knows you need it. Following a moment of interest rather than overriding it. Reconsidering something you've already said yes to because it no longer feels right. These are all small moments that say, my experience matters. And over time, those small moments begin to shift something internally. Shift that internal compass from, I shouldn't feel this, to, it makes sense that I feel this. And to do all of that, you need to recognize something. You will override yourself sometimes. You will ignore what you're noticing. You'll agree to things that don't quite fit. You'll move past something you needed to pay attention to because you're human. Trusting yourself doesn't come from getting every decision right. It comes from what you do next when you don't. From coming back to yourself. Noticing what happened without turning against yourself. Reflecting, adjusting, responding differently the next time. Because it's often in those small moments of coming back to ourselves that self-trust strengthens and grows the most. Not through perfection, but through the process of coming back to ourselves when we've got it wrong. So here's something to notice this week. Where are the small moments where you could respond to yourself? Not dramatically or disruptively, just slightly differently. Where might you pause instead of rushing? Express something instead of holding on to it. Rest instead of pushing through. And just notice what happens when you do just pause for a moment and notice. Because this is where it begins to connect back to your career and your life. As you start to trust your own internal signals more, the way you make decisions begins to change. You're not just looking outside of yourself anymore, you're including what's happening within you, your energy, that sense of relief or resistance, what holds your interest, what actually feels sustainable. And over time, your decisions begin to feel different. Less like something you have to figure out or to get right, and more like something you can feel your way into and through. So self-trust and trusting yourself isn't something that you wait to feel before you act. It's something that grows as you begin to act. In the small ways. By noticing. By responding. By coming back to yourself when you need to. And then doing it again. And over time, something begins to shift. You realize you can hear yourself. You realize you can respond to what you hear. And gradually, you begin to trust yourself. In the next episode, we'll explore something closely connected to this, and that's the idea of permission. Where it comes from, why it can feel conditional, and how many of us live inside invisible rules about what we're allowed to want, pursue, have, or change. When we come back, we'll explore all that together. So until then, take the very best care of yourselves. This has been Proactive Empowered Careers. If today's episode resonated, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss what comes next. And remember, your career isn't separate from who you are. It's an expression of you and the life you want to live.